Ambassador David Hayes watched through the viewport as hundreds of alien vessels converged on the neutral station hanging in deep space, each ship more elaborate than the last. Some sparkled with crystalline hulls that caught starlight like diamonds. Others stretched for kilometers with Gothic spires and weapon arrays, and a few pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed almost alive. The Galactic Council meeting had been called with unusual urgency, and every major species in known space was sending their most skilled diplomats and war leaders to discuss what many considered the greatest crisis in galactic history. For 3 standard years now, the Outer Rim territories had been burning with conflicts that seemed to spawn new wars faster than anyone could count them. Mining disputes had escalated into orbital bombardments. Religious differences had turned into ethnic cleansing campaigns, and trade disagreements had somehow evolved into full-scale military invasions that threatened to drag every civilized world into chaos. David's own transport ship looked almost embarrassingly simple compared to the magnificent vessels around it, just a converted freighter with basic diplomatic markings and no weapons worth mentioning, carrying a delegation of 12 humans who looked more like relief workers than representatives of a star-spanning civilization. "Sir, we're getting docking clearance for Bay 47, announced Lieutenant Sandra Kim from the pilot's seat, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had learned not to be intimidated by alien grandeur. "Take us in," David replied, adjusting his simple gray uniform that looked positively plain compared to the elaborate ceremonial garb he could see through the viewports of passing shuttles. The docking bay was a marvel of engineering that could accommodate vessels from dozens of different species with atmospheric zones and gravity fields adjusted for everything from methane-breathing, crystalline entities to massive slug-like beings that required high-pressure environments. As the human delegation disembarked, they found themselves immediately dwarfed by the sheer scale of alien diplomacy in action. Towering insectoid ambassadors clicked and chittered in languages that sounded like industrial machinery. Floating energy beings communicated through light patterns that hurt to look at directly, and hulking reptilian war chiefs practiced intimidation displays that had been perfected over millions of years of evolution. The station's central amphitheater was a sight that never failed to impress visitors, rising in concentric circles around a massive holographic display sphere that could show star charts, battle formations, or legal documents in 3-dimensional detail that made everything feel intensely real. Each species had claimed their traditional section of the amphitheater, based on ancient protocols that determined seating by military strength, economic influence, and diplomatic history. The Altarian hegemony commanded the highest tier with their 4-armed war chiefs resplendent in ceremonial armor that had been worn to 1,000 victories, while the crystalline Viridians occupied a specially constructed platform where their harmonic communications wouldn't interfere with translation systems. The humans had been assigned a modest section near the middle tiers, appropriate for a species that had only joined the galactic community 2 centuries ago and still qualified as newcomers by most standards. David noticed how other delegations were preparing for what everyone expected to be an epic session of political theater. The Altarians had brought holographic displays showing their military might and conquest histories. The Drakmari had carried in scroll cases containing thousands of years of legal precedents, and even the peaceful Centaurans had prepared elaborate charts demonstrating their economic analysis of every proposed solution. High Arbiter Noxtar took her position at the center of the amphitheater, her 6 eyes surveying the assembled representatives with an expression that conveyed both authority and deep frustration. She had presided over the council for 40 years and had never seen a crisis resist resolution for so long. Representatives of the Galactic Council. Her voice boomed through translation matrices that rendered her words into hundreds of different languages simultaneously. "We gather once again to address the continuing crisis in the Outer Rim territories for 3 standard years. Our greatest minds have debated jurisdiction, precedent, and proper response to conflicts that continue to escalate despite our deliberations," she continued, her tone growing sharper with each word. "The sectarian wars have displaced over 16 million beings. Trade routes that have existed for millennia have been severed, and now we face the possibility that these conflicts will spread to core systems if we cannot find resolution." A murmur ran through the assembly as representatives activated their personal translation devices and began consulting with their advisors. Everyone knew that this session would likely determine whether the galactic community could maintain any semblance of order or would fragment into competing power blocks. The Council has heard proposals for military intervention, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and even complete withdrawal from the affected regions, Noxtar announced. But none have achieved the consensus required for implementation. David watched as various species began their familiar pre-debate rituals. The Altarians synchronized their intimidation displays, the Viridians adjusted their harmonic frequencies to optimal persuasion settings, and the Drakmari elders began the ceremonial reading of relevant historical precedents. Today, we will hear from each major faction regarding their proposed solutions, beginning with the human delegation. Noxtar declared, her six eyes focusing on David with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. A ripple of interest ran through the amphitheater. Humans were known for unconventional approaches that sometimes bordered on the incomprehensible, and many species were curious to see what their young civilization would propose when faced with such a complex crisis. David rose from his seat, but surprised everyone by not approaching the grand central podium where speakers traditionally delivered their presentations. Instead, he walked to a small side table that had been largely ignored by other delegations. Honored representatives, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater without the theatrical amplification that most speakers preferred. Humanity has indeed prepared a response to the current crisis. The various alien delegations leaned forward in anticipation, expecting to hear another grand proposal filled with military strategies, economic theories, or legal frameworks that would compete with all the previous suggestions. War Chief Gorthak of the Altarians crossed his four massive arms, ready to dissect whatever battle plan the humans would present, while the Viridian crystals dimmed in preparation for harmonic analysis of human arguments. But David Hayes did something that no one in the amphitheater had prepared for. He set down his simple data pad and looked directly at the assembled representatives with an expression of quiet determination. "We're not going to debate this," he said simply, his words falling into the vast chamber like stones into still water. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of life support systems became audible, and even the translation matrices seemed to pause as if uncertain how to process such an unprecedented statement. Instead, David continued, his voice remaining calm and conversational, "We're going to show you what we've already done." The confusion rippling through the amphitheater was almost visible as thousands of alien minds tried to process what they had just heard. In the entire history of the Galactic Council, no delegation had ever refused to present formal arguments or engage in the traditional debate process that formed the foundation of civilized discourse. High Arbiter Noxtar's six eyes blinked in rapid sequence, a biological response that her species displayed when encountering something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. "Ambassador Hayes," she said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic protocol. "The Council requires formal presentation of positions, arguments, counter-arguments, and supporting evidence. Surely humanity has prepared the necessary documentation for review." "We have," David replied with the same conversational tone that seemed so out of place in the grand amphitheater. "But we've discovered something important about galactic politics during our 2 centuries of participation." He gestured toward the assembled representatives with a sweep of his arm that encompassed the entire magnificent gathering. "Everyone here is remarkably skilled at debate. You can argue the finest points of territorial law for decades, dissect military doctrine until stars burn out, and analyze economic theory with precision that would impress quantum computers," thought the Haing. Altarian war chiefs shifted restlessly in their ceremonial armor, unsure whether they were being complimented or insulted, while the Drakmari elders consulted among themselves in whispered tones that sounded like wind through ancient trees. "But here's what we noticed," David continued, his voice growing slightly more serious. "While you've been perfecting your arguments, real people in real places have been suffering and dying." The statement hit the assembly like a physical blow. Many species prided themselves on their sophisticated approach to problem-solving, and the suggestion that their methods might be inadequate was deeply unsettling. 3 years ago, when this crisis began, The contested Outer Rim territories had a combined population of approximately 47 million beings living on 19 different worlds, David said, activating a holographic display that showed a simple star chart. The display was notably different from the elaborate presentations other species typically used. No dramatic music, no swirling graphics, no intimidating military formations, just clean lines and factual information presented without flourish today. That population has dropped to 31 million. 16 million refugees have fled the ongoing conflicts, abandoning homes that their families had occupied for generations. A murmur of discomfort ran through the assembly as representatives began to grasp the human perspective on their prolonged deliberations. The question we faced wasn't whether intervention was legally justified according to Section 847 of the Territorial Disputes Resolution Framework, or whether military action would violate the non-interference doctrine established after the Proxima Wars, David explained. The question was whether we could sleep at night knowing that people were dying while we debated the perfect solution. Lieutenant Sandra Kim stepped forward and activated additional displays that showed something no one in the council had expected to see. Human vessels moving through the disputed territories, but not warships or invasion fleets. Instead, the holographics revealed converted freighters, medical ships, and transport vessels operating in patterns that looked more like a rescue operation than a military campaign. 6 months ago, we launched Operation Sanctuary, David announced, his words falling into a chamber that had grown completely silent. Rather than spending another year crafting arguments about why someone else should act, we decided to act ourselves. The implications of this statement sent shockwaves through delegations that had spent decades mastering the art of political maneuvering. The humans had simply bypassed the entire system. We've evacuated 2.3 million refugees to safe worlds outside the conflict zones, David continued as the displays updated to show refugee camps, medical stations, and temporary settlements scattered across neutral systems. We've established humanitarian corridors that allow medical supplies and food aid to reach civilian populations trapped in war zones. War Chief Gorthak rose from his seat, his forearms spreading in a gesture that human xenobiologists had learned to recognize as extreme agitation. You cannot simply ignore council authority and act unilaterally in disputed territories, he rumbled, his voice carrying harmonics that made the amphitheater's structural supports vibrate. That would constitute a violation of sovereignty agreements that have maintained galactic peace for centuries. David turned to face the massive Altarian with an expression of calm interest, rather than the defensive posture most species adopted when confronted by a war chief. You're absolutely right about the sovereignty issue, he agreed, surprising everyone with his immediate concession. That's why we didn't act unilaterally. The confusion in the chamber deepened as David's aide activated a new set of displays that showed something even more shocking than unauthorized human intervention. The holographics revealed that the refugee ships and medical stations weren't crewed exclusively by humans. Mixed teams of aliens from dozens of different species were working together in ways that seemed impossible given the political tensions that had deadlocked the council. Dr. Elena Martinez leads our trauma response teams, David explained, indicating a human figure in the display. But she works alongside Drakmari memory healers who can treat psychological wounds that conventional medicine cannot touch. Prime Minister Keita of the Drakmari Commonwealth leaned forward, her ancient features showing intense interest. Our harmonic therapy specialists operate side by side with Viridian crystal singers who can literally tune biological systems back to health. David continued, even Altarian combat medics have joined the effort, warriors who chose to save lives instead of taking them. Gorthak's forearms fell to his sides as he processed this information. The idea that his own people would participate in what seemed like a human operation challenged everything he understood about interspecies relations. Captain Robert Chen commands our primary refugee transport vessel, David said, highlighting another figure in the display. But his first officer is Commander Vectal of the Altarian 4th Fleet. The war chief's secondary arms began moving in patterns that human observers had learned indicated deep emotional conflict. Together, they've rescued over 40,000 civilians, including 3,000 Altarian colonists from the Proxima, raids who would have died without immediate evacuation. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications became clear. Somehow, without any formal agreements or official authorization, species that had been enemies for centuries were cooperating on a scale that surpassed anything the Council had ever achieved. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes focused on David with an intensity that felt like being caught in a tractor beam. "This is highly irregular," she said, her voice carrying undertones of both amazement and concern. The Council should have been informed of any major humanitarian initiative involving multiple species. There are protocols, procedures, notification requirements. We filed the appropriate notifications, Sandra Kim replied, stepping forward with a datapad that looked almost comically simple compared to the elaborate documentation systems used by other delegations. Standard Humanitarian Response Resolution 347B, submitted to the Council Secretariat 8 months ago, with quarterly progress reports filed according to established guidelines. The Secretariat's chief administrator, a nervous insectoid being named Pip, began frantically searching through official records while thousands of representatives watched in fascination. After several minutes of increasingly frantic data retrieval, Pip's mandibles clicked in what humans had learned was his species' equivalent of embarrassed admission. The notification was properly filed and categorized as a minor relief operation, he announced in a voice that barely carried beyond the first few rows. However, the scope described in the original filing appears to have been significantly exceeded. David allowed himself a small smile that somehow managed to be both humble and knowing. "That's because it started small," he explained. "Just 3 ships and 40 volunteers from Earth who wanted to help. But something interesting happened when we stopped debating whether to help people and started actually helping them." He paused, looking around the amphitheater, at faces that represented dozens of species, each showing expressions of intense curiosity despite their vastly different physiologies. Other people wanted to help too. The holographic display expanded to show something that defied everything the assembled diplomats thought they knew about interspecies relations. A vast network of cooperation that had somehow grown beyond the notice of the galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence agencies. David watched as representatives from dozens of species frantically activated their personal communication devices, trying to contact their intelligence services and military commands to verify what they were seeing. "The healer station at Kepler Junction," he explained, indicating a massive medical complex that appeared to be constructed from components designed by at least 6 different species, treats patients from every faction involved in the sectarian wars. The medical facility shown in the hologram was unlike anything in Council records. Drakmari biohealing pods connected seamlessly to Viridian harmonic therapy chambers, while Altarian trauma units operated alongside human surgical bays in a configuration that should have been impossible given the incompatible technologies. Dr. Sarah Williams runs the surgical department. David continued. But her team includes healers from 18 different species who have developed treatment protocols that none of them could have created alone. Prime Minister Keta of the Drakmari Commonwealth was consulting rapidly with her advisors, their whispered conversations carrying the musical tones that characterized their species' agitated state. "Impossible," she murmured, though her voice carried more wonder than disbelief. "Drakmari healing techniques require harmonic resonance with the patient's life force. Our methods cannot be integrated with alien medical technology." "That's what we thought too," David replied, his expression remaining conversational despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. But when Dr. Williams was trying to save a Drakmari child who had been injured in a bombing raid, she didn't have time to worry about technological incompatibility. The display zoomed in to show medical personnel working together in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about species barriers. She asked the child's parents to sing the traditional healing songs while her human surgical war team operated. The harmonic resonance that your species uses for biological repair turned out to synchronize perfectly with human brain patterns during complex procedures. Sandra Kim activated additional displays that showed similar impossible cooperations happening across dozens of facilities. Viridian crystal singers discovered that their harmonic frequencies could enhance Altarian combat stimulants to create non-addictive pain management for trauma patients. War Chief Gorthax. Forearms were now moving in complex patterns that human xenobiologists had never seen before. His species was apparently experiencing emotions for which they had no previous reference. Altarian regenerative medicine proved remarkably effective when combined with human psychological counseling techniques for treating refugees who had lost everything. The implications were staggering. Not only had these species found ways to work together, they had discovered that their supposedly incompatible approaches actually enhanced each other when applied to shared problems. The refugee camps, David continued, activating displays that showed temporary settlements scattered across neutral space, are operated jointly by species that have been enemies for centuries. The holographics revealed something that should have been impossible: Zephyrian collective ships working alongside hegemony of world's vessels to transport and house displaced. Populations Chancellor Vorth of the Centauran Alliance leaped to his feet, his usually composed diplomatic demeanor cracking under the strain of what he was witnessing. The Zephyrians and the hegemony have been in a state of Cold War for 300 years, he declared, his voice carrying harmonics of disbelief. They cannot even participate in the same council sessions without formal neutral mediation. How can they possibly be operating joint facilities? Turns out that when there's an injured child who needs shelter and medical attention, philosophical differences about territorial expansion seem a lot less important, David replied with the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the presentation. The display showed Zephyrian energy beings working alongside hegemony warriors to construct temporary housing that incorporated both species' environmental requirements. The refugees don't care whether their rescuers believe in collective consciousness or individual sovereignty. They care about having a safe place to sleep and enough food for their families. Sandra Kim highlighted a series of statistics that demonstrated the scope of what had been accomplished. Current displacement in the conflict zones has been reduced by 67% compared to conditions before Operation Sanctuary began. Casualty rates among civilian populations have dropped by 78% in areas where joint humanitarian corridors have been established. Most significantly, 6 separate ceasefires have been negotiated not through formal diplomatic channels, but through practical cooperation on the ground. The chamber was buzzing with activity as representatives tried to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about galactic politics. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes were blinking in patterns that indicated severe cognitive stress. Ambassador Hayes, she said slowly, what you are describing suggests that major interspecies conflicts can be resolved through humanitarian cooperation rather than formal diplomatic intervention. Not resolved, David corrected gently. Managed, the underlying political disputes that caused the sectarian wars are still there. Territorial claims, resource rights, religious differences, historical grievances that go back centuries. He paused, looking around the amphitheater at faces that showed a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. But here's what we discovered. When people are working together to solve immediate problems, they tend to develop practical solutions to longer-term issues as well. The display shifted to show a timeline of conflict resolution that had emerged organically from humanitarian cooperation. Mining disputes that had escalated into orbital bombardments were resolved when former enemies started working together to provide aid to displaced miners. Turns out that cooperation is more profitable than warfare. Religious tensions decreased dramatically when different groups found themselves working side by side to care for orphaned children. Shared purpose tends to overcome historical prejudices. Territorial conflicts became negotiable when the people living in disputed areas started focusing on rebuilding rather than defending. Hard to maintain a war when both sides are trying to help the same refugees. War Chief Gorthak slowly resumed his seat, his massive frame settling with the weight of someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. You are suggesting, he rumbled, that honor combat against shared enemies is more effective than honor combat against traditional foes. I'm suggesting that there are bigger enemies than each other. David replied. Hunger, disease, displacement, despair. These are foes that every species can fight together without compromising their core values. Prime Minister Keita was consulting with her advisors in the musical tones that characterized Drakmari deep thought. The implications for council procedures are staggering, she said finally. If humanitarian cooperation can achieve conflict resolution more effectively than formal diplomatic processes, then our entire approach to galactic governance may require fundamental revision. David's expression grew serious. For the first time during his presentation, "We're not suggesting that the Council abandon its important work," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect for the institution he was quietly revolutionizing. Formal diplomacy, legal frameworks, and political negotiations will always be necessary for long-term stability. But while you're developing perfect solutions, people are suffering from imperfect problems. He gestured toward the displays that showed the ongoing humanitarian operation. Operation Sanctuary isn't meant to replace council authority. It's meant to buy time and save lives, while better minds than ours work out permanent answers. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted his earlier statements. This was the contemplative silence of beings who were beginning to understand that they might be witnessing a fundamental shift in how galactic civilization approached its problems. What exactly? High Arbiter Noxtar asked slowly. Are you proposing that the Council do with this information? David Hayes smiled, and for the first time since the presentation began, his expression carried a hint of the diplomatic maneuvering that other species expected from formal negotiations. We're not proposing anything, he said quietly. We're inviting you to join something that's already working. The amphitheater had grown so quiet that the subtle hum of atmospheric processors became audible, creating an almost meditative backdrop as thousands of alien minds struggled to process what they were witnessing. David Hayes remained standing at his modest position, completely comfortable with the silence while representatives from across the galaxy frantically consulted their data networks, trying to verify claims that seemed to challenge the fundamental nature of interspecies relations, the sectarian wars. He continued, his voice cutting through the quiet contemplation like a gentle blade. We're being fueled by three primary factors that every analysis team had identified, but no diplomatic mission had successfully addressed. The holographic display shifted to show a complex web of cause and effect relationships, but instead of the tangled mess of competing interests that had stymied council debates for years, the human presentation revealed clear patterns that suggested actionable solutions. Resource scarcity in the outer systems was driving competition between species that had previously coexisted peacefully, David explained, highlighting trade routes and mining operations that had become flashpoints for violence. Corporate mining operations had displaced millions of beings from their traditional territories, creating refugee populations that strained the resources of neighboring systems. Religious and cultural tensions escalated when different groups were forced to compete for the same limited safe territories. Prime Minister Keita leaned forward, her ancient features showing the intense concentration that characterized her species when they encountered new concepts worthy of deep analysis. Ambassador Hayes. These factors have been discussed extensively in previous sessions, she said, her voice carrying the musical harmonics that indicated respectful disagreement. Every delegation has proposed solutions addressing resource distribution, territorial management, and cultural integration. The challenge has been achieving consensus on implementation. That's exactly the point, David replied, his expression showing genuine appreciation for her observation. While the council was debating which solutions were theoretically optimal, we focused on implementing solutions that were immediately practical. Sandra Kim activated new displays that showed the humanitarian operations' impact on each of the root causes David had identified. By providing immediate aid and temporary relocation assistance to displaced populations, we eliminated the competition for scarce resources that was driving much of the violence. The holographics revealed supply chains that seemed to materialize from nowhere: medical supplies, food, temporary housing, and transportation appearing in conflict zones without the massive bureaucratic infrastructure that typically accompanied council relief efforts. By establishing neutral refugee camps administered jointly by former enemies, we created spaces where different cultural groups could interact constructively rather than competitively. War Chief Gorthak studied the displays with the tactical analysis skills that had made him legendary among his people. "These supply lines," he rumbled, his forearms gesturing toward the holographic logistics networks, "they pass through territories controlled by hostile factions. How do unarmed humanitarian vessels maintain security in active war zones?" David's smile carried a hint of something that might have been mischief. "That's the most interesting part of the whole operation," he said, activating displays that showed something no military strategist had ever seen before. The holographics revealed humanitarian convoys moving through contested space, but instead of being protected by escort fleets or neutral zone agreements, they were being actively assisted by the same factions that were supposedly fighting each other. When Captain Robert Chen's refugee transport was attacked by Zephyrian raiders 3 months ago, the ship that came to their rescue was a hegemony patrol vessel that should have been shooting at Zephyrians on sight. The implications were staggering. Enemies who couldn't negotiate a simple ceasefire in council chambers were cooperating in the field when humanitarian missions were involved. When Dr. Sarah Williams needed to evacuate a medical station that was about to be overrun by factional fighting, both sides provided escort vessels to ensure the patients reached safety. Chancellor Vorth was rapidly cross-referencing these claims with intelligence reports from his own government. This suggests that the combatants in the sectarian wars maintain different rules of engagement for humanitarian operations than for military objectives, he said, his diplomatic training struggling to process such an unprecedented concept. "Exactly," David confirmed, "and that difference reveals something important about the nature of these conflicts." The display shifted to show communication intercepts and diplomatic exchanges that painted a picture very different from the chaotic warfare that Council intelligence had been reporting. Most of the factions involved in the sectarian wars don't actually want to be fighting. They're responding to pressures and circumstances that seem to leave them no choice. Resource scarcity forces them to compete for mining rights. But when humanitarian aid provides alternative resources, the competition becomes unnecessary. Territorial disputes drive them to defend traditional lands, but when refugee assistance reduces population pressure, the disputes become negotiable. Cultural conflicts escalate when different groups feel threatened, but when they're working together to help displaced families, the threats start looking manageable. Sandra Kim highlighted a series of communication logs that showed something remarkable. Informal negotiations happening between faction leaders who were supposed to be sworn enemies. 6 separate ceasefire agreements have been reached not through council mediation, but through practical cooperation on humanitarian missions. The chamber erupted in murmurs of amazement as representatives began to grasp the scope of what had been accomplished outside official diplomatic channels. Commander Rex Morrison of our medical frigate Hope's Dawn was treating wounded from both sides of the Proxima conflict when the opposing commanders started talking to each other in his sickbay. Within 3 hours, they had worked out a temporary truce to allow medical evacuations from the battlefield. That truce has now lasted 4 months and expanded to include joint patrols to protect humanitarian corridors. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes were focused intently on David, her expression showing the cognitive strain of someone whose fundamental assumptions were being systematically dismantled. "Ambassador Hayes, what you are describing suggests that humanitarian operations can achieve military objectives more effectively than military operations, not military objectives," David corrected gently. "Peace objectives. The goal isn't to win conflicts, the goal is to end them." He gestured toward the displays showing refugee camps where former enemies were working side by side. When people are focused on shared problems instead of historical grievances, they tend to discover that they have more in common than they thought. The holographics showed scenes that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. Altarian warriors teaching human engineers how to construct shelters that could withstand plasma bombardment, while Drakmari healers worked with Zephyrian energy beings to develop trauma treatments for species whose biology they barely understood. But surely, Chancellor Vorth interjected, this represents only a temporary stabilization, without addressing the underlying political and territorial disputes that cause these conflicts. Any peace achieved through humanitarian cooperation must remain fragile. David nodded, acknowledging the validity of the concern. You're absolutely right. This is a temporary solution designed to create space and time for permanent solutions to be developed. But here's what we've learned during the past 6 months of operations. Permanent solutions are much easier to negotiate when people aren't dying while you're discussing them. The silence that followed carried a different quality than the shocked quiet that had marked earlier parts of the presentation. This was the contemplative silence of beings who were beginning to understand that they might need to fundamentally reconsider their approach to galactic governance. Prime Minister Kata spoke slowly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic experience. The implications for council procedures are profound, she said. If humanitarian cooperation can create conditions for successful negotiation more effectively than formal diplomatic pressure, we're not suggesting that the council abandon its essential functions, David replied, his tone carrying genuine respect for the institution he was quietly revolutionizing. Long-term stability requires the kind of careful legal framework and political analysis that only this body can provide. But while you're developing those frameworks, real people in real places need immediate help that can't wait for perfect solutions. War Chief Gorthak rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame moving with the deliberate grace that characterized his species when they were processing profound concepts. You speak of honor combat against suffering itself, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that human translators rendered as deep respect. This is warfare against enemies that threaten all peoples equally. David's expression grew serious as he looked around the amphitheater at faces representing dozens of species, each showing varying degrees of comprehension and concern. The question isn't whether our approach is theoretically sound or procedurally perfect, he said quietly. The question is whether you want to help us make it better. The words hung in the vast amphitheater like a challenge that no one quite knew how to accept, creating a tension that seemed to make the very air shimmer with possibility and uncertainty. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes moved in complex patterns as she processed what David Hayes had just said, her species equivalent of deep cognitive stress becoming visible to anyone familiar with their behavioral patterns. Ambassador Hayes, she said carefully, each word measured and precise. While humanity's initiative demonstrates remarkable ingenuity and has apparently achieved significant humanitarian success, the Council cannot simply abandon established procedures that have maintained galactic stability for millennia. The legal frameworks, treaty obligations, and diplomatic protocols that govern interspecies relations exist for crucial reasons that cannot be overlooked in favor of expedient action. David nodded respectfully, his expression showing genuine appreciation for her concerns, rather than the defensive posture most species adopted when challenged by council authority. Honored Arbiter, we're not asking anyone to abandon anything, he replied, his voice maintaining the conversational tone that had characterized his entire presentation. We're asking the council to use those frameworks, treaties, and protocols to support something that's already working. Sandra Kim activated a new series of displays that showed something unexpected, comprehensive legal documentation that appeared to reference centuries of council precedent. Every action we've taken in Operation Sanctuary falls within existing humanitarian guidelines established by Resolution 2847 of the Third Galactic Accord, she announced, her voice carrying the precision of someone who had spent months ensuring legal compliance. The Drakmari delegation's legal advisor began frantically cross-referencing the citations, her musical whispers growing more urgent as she verified each reference. Every cooperation agreement we've facilitated follows protocols for emergency aid that have been in the Council legal code for over 400 years. Every ceasefire we've helped negotiate uses frameworks that were established after the Centauran Wars and have been successfully applied in 17 previous conflicts. Prime Minister Kita looked up from her advisor's rapid documentation review, her ancient features showing an expression that might have been amazement. They appear to be correct, she announced, her voice carrying harmonics of genuine surprise. Every action described has proper legal foundation within existing council. The humans have not violated any established protocols. A murmur of confusion ran through the assembly as representatives tried to understand how such a massive operation could have been conducted entirely within legal boundaries, without anyone noticing. Chancellor Vorth leaned forward, his diplomatic instincts telling him that something important was happening that he didn't fully comprehend. But surely the scope and scale of these operations exceed anything contemplated by standard humanitarian protocols, he said, consulting his own legal advisors. Standard protocols, David agreed, but not emergency protocols. When the Council established emergency humanitarian guidelines, they specifically allowed for expanded operations in response to crisis situations that exceeded normal parameters. Sandra Kim highlighted specific sections of Council law that most representatives had forgotten existed. Section 847C permits unlimited expansion of humanitarian aid when refugee displacement exceeds 2 million beings. Current displacement in the Outer Rim territories is 16 million beings. Subsection 12 allows for cooperative agreements between any Council species for emergency medical response without formal diplomatic authorization. Subsection 19 permits temporary suspension of territorial restrictions for vessels engaged in life-saving operations. War Chief Gorthak was studying the legal citations with the same intensity he normally reserved for battle plans. "You are saying that the law already permits what you have done," he rumbled. But the Council was unaware that the conditions for invoking emergency protocols had been met. "The Council was informed," David replied gently. "But the notification was filed as a routine humanitarian aid mission because that's what it was when we started. The legal framework was designed to allow operations to expand organically in response to need. We just followed the law as it was written." The implications were staggering. The humans had not circumvented Council authority but had instead used it more effectively than the Council itself. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes focused on David with an intensity that felt like being examined by a quantum scanner. "What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador Hayes?" David gestured to his small delegation, and for the first time representatives noticed that the human team looked more like relief workers than traditional diplomats. "The Council should continue its essential work of developing long-term policies, resolving complex disputes and maintaining the legal frameworks that govern interspecies relations," he said. Meanwhile, a joint task force drawing on the expertise and resources of all member species could begin immediate response to ongoing humanitarian crises throughout Council space. Think of it as the Council's hands while the Council's mind works on permanent solutions. The concept was so simple that it took several moments for the full implications to register with the assembled diplomats. Sandra Kim activated displays showing 17 other crisis situations across Council territory that could benefit from the same approach. The Andromedan famine affecting 8 million beings across 4 systems. The industrial disaster on Rigel 7 that has displaced 3 million workers and their families. The plague outbreak in the Vega colonies that requires coordinated medical response from multiple species. The asteroid mining accident in the Centauri belt that has left 200,000 beings stranded in deteriorating orbital habitats. Each crisis appeared on the holographic display, with real-time casualty figures and resource requirements that painted a picture of suffering on a scale that formal diplomatic processes had never been designed to address. Every one of these situations could be managed using the same approach we've applied to the sectarian wars. David explained, "Immediate humanitarian response to stabilize conditions while the Council develops comprehensive long-term solutions." War Chief Gorthak rose to his full imposing height, his forearms moving in patterns that human xenobiologists had learned to associate with profound decision-making. The Altarian hegemony possesses rapid response fleets that could be deployed for humanitarian operations, he announced, his voice carrying harmonics of formal commitment. "If the Council approves this joint task force concept, we pledge our participation." The statement sent shockwaves through the assembly. The Altarians were legendary for their military prowess but had never volunteered for humanitarian missions. Prime Minister Keita stood slowly, her aged frame moving with the dignity that came from centuries of leadership. "The Drakmari Commonwealth offers our medical expertise and healing technologies," she declared, her musical voice carrying across the amphitheater. "Our bioregeneration facilities could be adapted for multi-species humanitarian response." The Viridian delegation began emitting harmonic patterns that their translators eventually rendered as formal agreement to provide their crystal-based healing technologies for joint operations within minutes. 17 different species had offered resources and expertise for humanitarian missions that hadn't yet been officially approved by any governing body. Chancellor Vorth looked around the chamber with an expression of bewildered amazement. "This is unprecedented," he murmured. "The Council has never achieved consensus this rapidly on any major initiative." High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes were blinking in patterns that indicated severe cognitive overload. "The Council requires time to review these proposals through proper channels," she announced, though her voice carried less authority than usual. "Formal committees must be established, legal frameworks must be analyzed, resource allocation must be debated." "Of course," David agreed readily. "Take all the time you need for proper review and formal approval." Meanwhile, the transport vessel New Dawn departs for the Vega system tomorrow morning to begin emergency medical support for the plague outbreak. If any of your species would like to send representatives to observe the operation, or better yet, to participate, Captain Robert Chen has space for additional volunteers. The silence that followed was different from any quiet that had ever descended on the council chambers. It was the silence of beings who suddenly realized that they were being invited to stop talking and start doing something constructive. And for the first time in the council's long history, that invitation was proving irresistible. What followed was something that had never occurred in the 3,000-year history of the Galactic Council. Complete, absolute silence from every single representative in the vast amphitheater. Not the dramatic pause of a skilled orator waiting for effect. Not the contemplative quiet of deep deliberation. Not even the stunned silence that had marked earlier parts of David's presentation. This was the profound silence of thousands of highly sophisticated minds simultaneously realizing that their entire approach to galactic governance had just been quietly and politely turned completely upside down. High Arbiter Noxtar's 6 eyes moved through blinking patterns that xenobiologists would later classify as fundamental reality recalibration, her species' biological response to encountering information that challenged the basic assumptions underlying their worldview war chief. Gorthic's 4 massive arms hung motionless at his sides, frozen in the middle of what had been an intimidation display before his brain simply stopped processing the familiar patterns of diplomatic confrontation. The crystalline Viridians had gone completely dark, their harmonic communications falling, silent for the first time in recorded council history, as their collective consciousness struggled to integrate concepts that didn't fit their existing frameworks. Even the peaceful Drakmari sat in stunned contemplation, their musical communications reduced to barely audible whispers that sounded like wind through empty corridors. For 3 standard years, the greatest diplomatic minds in the galaxy had been locked in increasingly complex debates about jurisdiction, legal precedent, proper procedure, and theoretical frameworks for addressing the growing crisis in the Outer Rim territories. They had prepared for every possible argument, anticipated every conceivable counterpoint, and developed sophisticated responses to every nuance of galactic law and interspecies relations. None of them had prepared for someone to simply ignore the entire debate and solve the problem, while they were still talking about it. David Hayes remained standing calmly at his modest position near the side of the amphitheater, having never moved to the grand central podium that every other speaker in council history had used for their presentations. His entire demonstration had been delivered from the periphery of the chamber, with simple displays and conversational language that contained no theatrical flourishes, no dramatic declarations, no appeals to ancient traditions or cultural superiority. He had simply presented facts, offered cooperation, and invited participation in something that was already working. Prime Minister Keta was the first to break the silence, her ancient voice carrying a note of wonder that made her sound centuries younger. In 800 years of Drakmari participation in this council, she said slowly, we have never witnessed anything like this. She paused, struggling to find words for something that had no precedent in her vast experience. We have never seen a delegation present a solution that was already implemented, working, and legally compliant without any formal authorization or oversight. Chancellor Vorth managed to find his voice next, though it took several attempts before he could form coherent words. Ambassador Hayes, what you have accomplished isn't just unorthodox, he said, his diplomatic training struggling to categorize what he was witnessing. It's functional. A ripple of something that might have been nervous laughter ran through the chamber as representatives began to grasp the full implications of that simple statement. The human approach wasn't just different from traditional council methods. It was actually working better than anything the council had ever achieved. War Chief Gorthak slowly resumed his seat, his massive frame settling with the weight of someone whose entire understanding of honor combat had just been redefined. You have shown us warfare against suffering itself, he rumbled, his voice carrying harmonics of profound respect. This is combat that brings honor to all participants regardless of species or traditional allegiances. The Viridian crystals began to emit faint harmonic patterns as their collective consciousness started processing the new paradigm. Their translators eventually rendered their communications as expressions of resonant solution architecture, their term for discovering that separate frequencies could combine to create outcomes greater than the sum of their individual contributions. High Arbiter Noxtar rose slowly from her position at the center of the amphitheater, something that rarely happened during standard proceedings. Ambassador Hayes, she said, her voice carrying the weight of millennia of diplomatic tradition. In 3,000 years of council history, no delegation has ever left this assembly speechless. David's expression showed genuine humility rather than triumph. Honored Arbiter, perhaps that's because everyone was so focused on perfecting their arguments that they forgot the most important question. Which is? Noxtar asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer, whether we're here to win debates or solve problems. The simplicity of the statement hit the assembly like a physical force. For centuries, the council had evolved into an institution focused on the sophisticated art of diplomatic discourse, legal precedent, and political maneuvering. Skills that were undoubtedly important, but had somehow become ends in themselves rather than means to actual solutions. Sandra Kim began powering down the holographic displays, but not before showing one final image. A simple star chart displaying the current locations of humanitarian operations throughout council space. The invitation remains open, David said as he prepared to leave. Operation Sanctuary continues, its work regardless of formal council approval or participation. But we've discovered that cooperation makes everything more effective, and we believe that formal council support could help us reach people we haven't been able to help yet. As the human delegation gathered their modest equipment and prepared to depart, representatives from dozens of species approached them, not to debate policy or negotiate agreements, but to offer immediate practical assistance. The Altarian Fourth Fleet can provide security escorts for medical convoys. War Chief Gorthak announced, Drakmari biohealing ships are available for deployment to plague-affected systems, declared Prime Minister Keta. Viridian harmonic therapy platforms can be reconfigured for refugee support operations, came the translated offer from the Crystal Collective within the space of minutes. More concrete commitments had been made than the Council typically achieved in months of formal deliberation. High Arbiter Noxtar stood alone in the center of the amphitheater as representatives filed out, many stopping to coordinate directly with the human delegation about joint operations that hadn't been officially authorized by anyone. This session is temporarily suspended, she announced to the nearly empty chamber, pending review of unprecedented procedural circumstances. But her words carried no real authority. The session had effectively ended the moment David Hayes had shown them that action was more powerful than argument. As the last representatives departed, Noxtar remained in the vast empty space, her six eyes focused on a simple truth that had somehow escaped the notice of the galaxy's most sophisticated diplomatic minds. While they had been perfecting the art of debate, a small delegation from a young species had been perfecting the art of actually helping people, and in doing so, they had accomplished something that no amount of sophisticated rhetoric had ever achieved. They had left the entire Galactic Council speechless, not through superior arguments or overwhelming evidence, but by demonstrating that sometimes the best response to a crisis isn't another speech. Sometimes it's just getting to work. The Council would eventually adapt to this new paradigm, creating formal structures to support the kind of immediate humanitarian response that Operation Sanctuary had pioneered. But they would never forget the day that humanity had taught them the difference between talking about solutions and actually implementing them. In the end, the humans had won the most important victory possible in galactic politics. Not the victory of being right, but the victory of being helpful.